Hey guys, Kelly here. Today I wanted to do another sewing related video, and I'm going to be talking about sewing clips versus sewing pins, different advantages for each of them and different applications, and why I personally choose one over the other most of the time. But I will go ahead and tell you that I definitely see a place for both of them, and I do keep both of them in my stash. So I'll go ahead and start by showing you what sewing clips are, because they're probably what you're less familiar with if you've never sewn or if you are just getting new to sewing. So these are sewing clips. They look like this. Actually, that's upside down. It looks like this. And they're usually about a 1/2 inch deep, which is good if you work with 1/2 inch seam allowances often, because they can kind of be a guide for you to look at. And they do come in larger sizes as well. So if you need a larger size, if you're working with something really bulky, they can be good for those times as well. And I will say there are brand names like Wonder Clips and things like that, but you can also find off-brand versions that are a lot cheaper, and I definitely recommend doing that if you're sewing on a budget like I am. So I'm going to start by talking about the pros and cons of sewing clips, and then I'll talk about pins later because, like I said, you're probably more familiar with pins, and I am a little bit biased towards one of these things. So sewing clips are great for sewing with thick layers of fabric. If you're using pins, it's really hard to get your needle in and back out of thick fabrics without bending them, so sewing clips are awesome for that. They're also great for things like leather or certain silk fabrics that show puncture holes. So leather obviously is non-woven. It cannot close once it's been punctured, so it will have holes forever after you puncture it. And same with vinyl or other leather substitutes. Things like cork as well that are other non-woven fabrics. And then certain silk fabrics will show pinholes just because of the nature of silk and how it behaves differently than some other fabrics. Things like taffeta that are more, not stiff, but they just have a different body than some other fabrics, they will be more likely to show pinholes. So clips can be great for things like that as well. They also do not cause runs in delicate fabrics. That's one advantage of clips, but a disadvantage of clips is that they can weigh down delicate fabrics. So you really have to weigh the pros and cons, whether you want to risk having a run or risk them weighing down the fabric and distorting the seam as you're sewing it. I would say if you're working with the delicate fabric, the best thing to do would probably be to use those really micro thin pins, because they won't run or distort your fabric, but we'll get more into pins in a minute. They're also good for using with a serger, the clips are, because you're less likely to run into them than you are a pin, because pins, you can kind of not see them or miss them, and then you can try to serge over them on accident and break the knife of your serger or damage the knife of your serger, whereas with a clip, you're not really going to miss seeing that. You're going to see it right there because they're bulky and big. Some cons of clips are that they can't be used for things like darts or pleats very easily because they are not very precise and the fabric can shift underneath them. It can distort and weigh down the fabric, like I said, when you're working with something stretchy or something really lightweight and drapey. It can pull down on it, especially if you're working with a long seam where it's hanging over the edge of your table. And you can't sew as close to them as you can pins because they're so big. So now I'm going to get into pins. Like I said, some of the things with pins and clips, sometimes it depends on what kind of pins we're talking about. So I said they can cause runs, but if you get the really thin pins, you're not going to cause runs or not be as likely to cause runs as you are with the thicker pins. So if you're working with really, really delicate fabrics, I would actually recommend thin micro pins over either one of the normal options. But I'm going to just get into just your general standard pin now. Lightweight fabrics can't be weighed down by them because they're so light, and you can sew right up to them as opposed to clips where you can't get as close. So they're really good for precision work, things like darts, pleats, and gathers, because you can fit more of them and they don't press down on your fabric. You can pin and still have your gather sticking up around the pins, so that when you're sewing you get the desired effect. And the cons of pins are that they can leave puncture marks in certain fabrics and they can cause runs in delicate fabrics. Like I said, if you're using standard size pins, if you're using thin pins, that's a whole different story. And some tips I have for if you do like pins but you run into some issues with them. I know some people prefer clips because they don't distort the fabric in the sense that they don't cause a rippling effect where you're pinning. One way to combat this is to pin with your pin head hanging off the edge of the fabric. That will prevent that rippling a little bit. And another way to prevent the rippling is to use flat head pins. So as you can see, here's my pin. It's really skinny, and the head is almost the same size as the pin body. It's just a little bit thicker. and this will lay flat on top of your fabric and won't cause that rippling effect like something like this, which is more standard, that has that thick head on the end. Sorry, it's blurry, but the head is so much thicker than the pin body that it will ripple a little bit more. Like I said, flat pins and pinning off the edge of your fabric is the best way to avoid that. I also recommend horizontal pinning because you can sew right up to your pins. If you have your pin in vertically with the way you're sewing, you can only sew up to the edge of your pin, and then you have this long gap where your pin was that you have to take out. And so especially if you're a beginner, pinning horizontally and pinning more will mean that it'll hold your seam together and you won't have to worry as much about your fabric shifting and trying to figure that all out in addition to learning how to sew. Really, it may take more time to pin more, but when you're first learning, pins can be really helpful. And I actually think, personally, in my experience, clips are more cumbersome and frustrating when you're trying to work with something that's new, and because they're heavy and because they get in the way, you know, all that stuff. I'd say pins are probably easier for a beginner, but definitely go based off of what you think you will work better with, because we're all different and we all have different opinions and different frustrations. So that's just my 2 cents. I feel like I was talking a mile a minute, so sorry about that. But I hope you enjoyed, and if you have some other sewing tools that you'd like me to compare, let me know. So thanks for watching.